Welcome to the Quiet Casefiles, a place for calm, careful mysteries told slowly and without urgency. Each episode is a fictional whodunit, and you are invited to listen closely and see if you can solve the case before it is quietly set to rest. If you enjoy these stories, please consider liking, subscribing, and following to hear more. A gentle request, keep the comments spoiler-free so everyone can try the clues on their own. Make yourself comfortable, lower the lights if you like, and let the sound of the narration be enough company for a while. I will describe only what I saw. You may notice something even I missed. I came to the Lighthouse Hotel on a grey afternoon when the sea was a low, patient drum, and the tide had that particular taste of iron. The road narrowed to a single strip of stone at the headland. At high water, it would be entirely cut off, and that was one reason the owners kept this place open in the quiet months. There is a quality to a house that has been obliged to stand alone against weather for a long time, a tendency to small, private rituals. I noticed those rituals in the way the door was ledged, in how the windows wore their salt like someone wearing an old scarf. The building itself had the unapologetic bones of a former keeper's residence. The lantern tower rose from one corner, a squat, patient thing with its glass catching the light whenever a gust parted the clouds. Inside, the room smelled of tea and beeswax, and there were narrow stairways that remembered many feet. It was, in other words, the exact sort of place that encourages people to come when they want to be left alone. The innkeeper met me at the hall with a key ring and a towel dampened with sea-scented vinegar. Margaret Holt. Maggie, she told me to call her, had hands that looked as if they had learned to do small, steady things for a very long time. She moved through the hallway with a careful economy, showing me where the rooms were and doing that small, practical thing hosts do, making a place feel as if it is already waiting. I noticed the ledger on her counter and the neat way she wrote arrivals and departures. The logbook had a habit of keeping quiet things honest. I accepted a cup of tea because there is a particular clarity that comes with tea and a new set of names. Habit, perhaps. I prefer a window seat when I travel, and the small table near the pane let me watch the channel as other guests came and went. The weather was tightening when they arrived. People traveling for solitude tend to move with light luggage and heavier attention. The first guest I noticed by detail rather than introduction, an elegant woman who kept her scarf in a slow spiraled knot, who carried a small leather case, and who set herself in a chair with an economy that made everything around her appear as if it had been chosen for her. Claire Beaumont was the sort of name one expects quietly on an envelope. It fit her without fuss. She asked for a room with a west-facing window, and then, as if resisting any questions about herself, closed a small, worn notebook and set it in her lap. There was the suggestion of sealed envelopes beneath the flap of her bag, as if she had come carrying small private weather. I noticed the way she looked at the sea as though it were both a comfort and a ledger. A young man arrived later, with a battered notebook, a jacket that had seen rain, and a pair of shoes that still smelled of a different shore. Marcus Hale. He introduced himself only when the kettle sang twice and the room had warmed from the chill, spoke with a voice that liked words to be measured. He said he had come to write and to watch the storm, though he also watched others with the curious, tidy attention of someone recording details. His hands were quick. He kept opening and closing the little leather notebook, as if afraid to leave it alone. At dusk, a woman with paint, smudged on the cuff of her sleeve, appeared with a canvas rolled under her arm. She moved as if she were continuing a conversation with the light outside the window. Nora Pine said little, and what she did say was economical and precise. She had come to study the color of the sea when the weather turned. Her hair was tied with a strip of cloth that had an ochre stain near the knot. The smudge caught my eye, not because it announced anything, but because it spoke of a habit, the way hands meet the world through their work. 2 more people arrived before the meal, Dr. Moore. Elias Finch, a quietly reserved man who carried a small satchel of instruments and a notebook scrawled with charts, and Reverend Samuel Pritchard, who walked as though the soles of his shoes had been designed for long, solitary steps. Both moved toward the common room with the same polite caution one expects when strangers measure one another's distance for the first time. "Doctor," Finch made some quiet, almost private observation about the tide before he set his things down. Reverend Pritchard kept the program compact: a small book, a folded handkerchief, the polite pressure of someone who tends to listen more than speak. Dinner that evening was a small, careful thing. Stew that smelled of onion and bay, bread from a local oven with a crust that split the right way, and the steady presence of Maggie moving from table to table. Guests drifted into conversational patterns, the way birds drift into shelter. A line of comments about the weather, a question or two about the lighthouse, an exchange of small facts. I observed as much as a guest can in a public room where the quiet is given its own weight. My presence did not announce itself. I asked one or two modest questions and left space for others to form the outlines of their stories. People arrive at retreats for different reasons. It occurred to me that this place made plausible reasons for everyone: to finish something, to forget something, to look closely at the edge of the world for a while. The important thing, I told myself, was to notice the small discrepancies in routine, the things that feel slightly out of place when a room has set its own rules. I think of myself as an observer rather than an interpreter in these moments. It is a modest preference. I prefer to collect details first and allow them to speak for themselves. So the night closed with the lighthouse turning a slow, deliberate wheel of light. The weather on the distant horizon had the look of ink pooling in a glass. People retired with their private habits intact. Claire took her notebook. Nora wrapped her canvas in oilcloth and said she would be up early to paint. Marcus made a note he said aloud to himself and then tucked his hand in his coat as if to warm it. The house settled into the minor creaks that a place at the edge of things keeps like a quiet clock. I walked to my room with a cup cooled to just comfort, and through the window the sea kept its steady percussion, untroubled by human decisions. I left the kettle to its own cooling and made a small note in my own head. There is a particular quality to silence before dawn. One might wonder what the night will keep and what it will give back at first light. Morning on the headland had a way of smoothing out intentions. By the time the wind loosened the last of the cloud, the house was awake to its own rhythm. Maggie in the kitchen with her tin of loose tea, the Reverend laying out his book, Marcus at the window with a cup, and a slow, deliberate frown. People had their small practices here, the arrangements that keep an insular place honest. It occurred to me that such things are useful for more than comfort. They are the scaffolding by which time allows itself to be measured. Breakfast was quiet in the way that meals between strangers often are. Conversation began with trivialities, weather forecasts, the condition of the road, where the best view could be had, and then slowly drew nearer to other matters, as if the sea itself had been doing the work of softening edges. I noticed how Claire tended her tea the way someone tends a ledger, deliberately, with attention to measurement. She kept a small stack of sealed envelopes in the inner pocket of her coat. She spoke of letters as if they were an instrument rather than a confession. I could not see their contents. I could only see that she guarded them with a care that suggested they were important in a way she did not wish to name. Nora set up an easel by the long sash window and spent the morning watching a single strip of tide, dipping her brush almost meditatively. Her movements were so quiet they seemed to belong to the house as much as to her. The ochre on her cuff flashed now and again like a private punctuation. She was the sort of person who moved through space by leaving small, precise traces. I noticed paint on the soles of her shoes where she had stepped in a puddle of mixed pigment. It marked where she had been and, perhaps, where she intended to be again. Marcus made notes and then read them aloud to no one in particular, a method, he said, helped the sentences find balance. He spoke once about a newspaper article he had read some months ago concerning the preservation of coastal buildings. He did not name names, but he implied that there are people who profit from decisions that make others lose a place to stand. His voice held a kindling interest that made the conversation useful to other listeners. When he looked at Claire, there was a quickness in his gaze as if he were cataloguing an element in a larger composition. Dr. Elias Finch was not a man who sought the company of strangers more than necessary. He took notes in a small, careful script and, when asked about his instruments, spoke of tides and currents with an unhurried clarity. He had a compact knowledge of where the rocks lay under the waves, as if he carried in his head a map of the unseen. He mentioned non-committally that he had been in correspondence with someone about changes on the shoreline. His tone suggested disagreement rather than anger. Reverend Sam wore a woolen coat that had seen many walks and had the habit of placing a hand on a door frame as if blessing the threshold. He was the least abrasive of presences, the sort of person who could help another find a phrase for what they could not otherwise name. He asked careful questions about the housekeeping, and he listened when Maggie described the placid business of the inn. Maggie had a way of knowing a house's needs, the way others know their own hands. She moved through the rooms in a tidy choreography, folding napkins, checking the logs, oiling the lanterns that were kept for emergency use. Her private concern was small and practical. The ledger showed thin months and a wish to keep the lights on. She admitted to no one in particular that winter had made the numbers tight and that the house depended on guests who believed in quiet. When people introduce themselves in a house like this, there are courtesies and half-reveals. Claire, for example, mentioned that she had been managing a number of affairs and had come to the coast for perspective. When Marcus asked what kind of affairs, she smiled slightly and said matters of taste and property, which can mean many things. She was guarded, but not hostile. She was someone who had learned the utility of discretion. I noticed a small leather pouch at her elbow which she kept returning to with the same habitual, indifferent touch one uses to test for a pulse. It is worth saying, as a detail that felt important in retrospect, that Claire had a small pile of receipts and a calendar with several dates circled. The calendar was not open to me, but the presence of circles on an otherwise blank page suggests appointments rather than memories. I mention this because those circles became, later, one of the things the house remembered. The first afternoon drew long shading fingers through the windows and the guests drifted into their various quiet pursuits. Marcus took a long walk, returning with wet cuffs and a pocket full of seaweed. Reverend Sam sat with a book and occasionally looked up as if listening for some distant answer. Dr. Finch disappeared for a while to check an instrument he kept by the back door. Nora painted steadily as if laying the tide down in layers. Claire made notes and, once, used a fine pen to tear open an envelope and then immediately refold it as if she had only glanced to remind herself what it contained. There were small frictions. Marcus and Claire had a brief exchange about an article he had mentioned. The tone was civil but edged. Dr. Finch and Claire had words about development matters, a phrase I registered but did not pry into. Nora at one point looked up sharply at something that was said and then returned to her brush as though to bury the gesture in colour. I noticed things without imposing stories on them. One might say that I was cataloguing the house's small signatures, the way chairs were moved, the habit of making tea at certain hours, who went down to the shore and when. People create a map for themselves, even when they insist they seek only solitude. There is a map of routines that any careful observer can follow, and where one routine intersects another, small disagreements and reconciliations are often quietly settled or left to fester. That evening, over a modest supper, Claire mentioned she had a stack of letters that she intended to dispose of before she left. She said it without drama, but there was a tautness in the way she spoke. At some point, Maggie offered to keep the letters for her if she wished it, and Claire declined with a polite wave. Conversation eased. The lighthouse wheeled its steady light out over the dark sea. The house prepared itself for night in the same way the sea prepares for storm. Quiet, deliberate, and without much ceremony. I made a small note in the margins of my mind. The house keeps records, people keep letters, and the tide is indifferent. It occurred to me that when people come together under such conditions, the small things are often where one finds the shape of what will happen next. The storm moved in sometime after midnight with a patience that made it feel inevitable rather than surprising. Wind came in long, slow breeze, and the rain had a steady, insistive quality, not violent so much as determined. The house kept to itself. I had been sitting by my window with a small lamp and a notepad, the sort of small private work one does to keep nights from becoming a single, continuous thing. There is a particular quality to such nights, the sense that small decisions have weight. Maggie found Claire early in the morning, before the first grey of dawn had quite settled. She was in the library, seated in a chair that had the look of being kept for solitude, one hand holding a book and the other folded near a small, neat pile of envelopes. When Maggie called out, there was no answer. She went in, closed the door behind her, and said later that the room had that peculiar hush that made even the kettle seem loud. Someone always notices these things first, and Maggie could describe a room with the same exactness she used in her accounts. We gathered in the doorway because that is what people do. The living gather around the place where something has altered the ordinary line of the day. I will not dwell on the shape of what we found in any particular detail. There is no need for it, and the moment does not ask for spectacle. Claire had collapsed in her chair. She was not moved, and there was no sign of a struggle. My first clear observation was a small smear of ochre on the edge of her sleeve and a torn envelope in her hand, partially opened. The kettle on the side table had cooled, but retained a faint warmth. There was a small, disturbed patch of carpet as if someone had set down a canvas on the floor and then left in a hurry. People's reactions were quiet and immediate. Maggie, who first found her, stood with her hand to her mouth and then set it down to steady herself. Marcus knelt and looked at the envelope, his face tight with something like professional curiosity. Nora stood at the window as if the light could explain what had happened. Her hands were clean where one would have expected pigment. Dr. Muntz. Finch checked for a pulse with a cautious economy, and Reverend Sam murmured a prayer so soft it might have been for the house rather than the person. There was nothing in the room to suggest theft or a struggle. Nothing overturned beyond the small disorder of that chair. Still, something in the arrangement was off. The lamp was turned almost imperceptibly toward the mantel, and a small paperweight lay on the table with a faint smear of ochre along its rim. The torn envelope was addressed in Claire's hand to a name none of us recognized at a glance, and it had been opened and partly emptied as if someone had removed a single page and then refolded the rest. When an event like this occurs in a place of retreat, there is a peculiar compression of time. The day rearranges itself around that one point. Maggie called the mainland for help and discovered, as we all did in that hour, that the storm and the tide had made the road uncertain. Help would be delayed. We became, in effect, custodians of a scene, people required by circumstance to hold the place until the authorities could arrive. It is a strange position for a group of strangers to adopt with one another. We respond in patterns that are polite and practical. We make tea. We cover the form with a blanket if it seems appropriate. We measure our words. There were small things I noticed without making them into judgments. Claire's wristwatch was stopped at 2:03. There was a faint scent of bergamot in the air, perhaps from the tea. A pressed sprig of seaweed lay between the pages of the book she held, as if she had been marking a sentence that reminded her of some shore. The torn fragment of paper in her hand had a few lines written in a firm, neat hand, and there was a smudge of what looked like paint on the edge. Each guest had a different way of keeping distance. Marcus walked to the window and watched the surf with a steady intensity. Nora pinched the bridge of her nose and then walked quickly to the easel as if to confirm that paint could still be made to mean something. Dr. Half. Finch went to the back door and checked the ground with the practicality of someone who reads soil like a book. Reverend Sam folded his hands and looked toward the lantern as if hoping a light might say something about the shape of morality. I asked the sorts of questions one asks when the practical needs of the moment come first. When had anyone seen Claire awake and about? Who had been in the library the night before? Are there any keys missing? Maggie consulted her ledger and found that Claire had been up late. She had made a note to herself at 2:40 in the morning. Marcus recalled seeing a light by the library window at that time. Nora said she had been awake and painting somewhere near the stairwell. None of the answers were, in themselves, a solution. They were only anchors. It occurred to me then that a scene holds both what happened and what people bring to it. I noticed patterns. The small smudge on Claire's sleeve matched the ochre on Nora's cuff. The paperweight with paint might be from a pocket of paint nearby. There was a footprint at the edge of the gravel outside the library door that did not match the heavier boots Dr. Finch had been wearing. It was smaller and had a faint trace of pigment clinging to its edge. Yet for each observation there was an alternate explanation. A footprint can mean a route taken for a dozen reasons. A paint smear can be transferred by the most innocent of gestures. We made the room secure. We placed the envelopes together on a tray and left them untouched. People spoke in low voices. Marcus suggested we write down what had happened in case memory softened. Reverend Sam offered to keep watch and say some words. I found myself sliding into the habit of asking more than asserting, listening more than proclaiming. There is a modest art to being present when an event like this happens, to hold questions patiently and to give people room to answer them without pressure. Outside, the storm kept its steady rhythm. Inside, the house arranged its breath around what had occurred. It occurred to me then, and I wrote it down, that when ordinary lives are condensed into a single small space, the ordinary habits, the time someone stands by the window, the way tea is made, the marks of paint on a cuff, become the features one must use to draw a map. I would need them all in the days to come. The first day after any sudden event is a day of lists, names, times, places. We made those lists because the mind prefers a ledger when the world has shown itself to be less predictable than usual. Maggie had a page in her logbook for arrivals and departures, and she added columns for last seen and notes. The entries were neat, the sort of penmanship that keeps a house honest. I wrote my own notes as well, not to take the place of others, but to try and hold the small details steady. We began, as is sensible, by asking simple questions of one another. Who had seen Claire awake during the night? Who had reason to go to the library? No one was evasive. People were, however, unevenly certain of what they remembered. Marcus said he had seen an interior light at roughly 2:40 and had thought it was a guest reading. Nora said she had painted until 1:30 and then gone to the stairwell to fetch another tube of colour, which required walking past the library door. Dr. 2. Finch had been outside checking an instrument he kept near the rocks. The path he took would bring him by the back door. Reverend Sam said he had been awake, but he was not sure he had left his room that night. People told the stories they could tell without self-exposure. Nora admitted finally that she had been anxious when Claire had been in the room because Claire had been persistent in asking after a certain painting. "She wanted something I hadn't chosen to sell," Nora said in a voice that did not seek pity. "She kept asking until I told her no. I thought she'd stop, but she didn't." There is something honest about the way people give the limits of what they will discuss. It suggests where the edges of privacy lie. Marcus, who had a journalist's appetite for facts, said that he'd been looking into a few matters connected to people who make decisions about coastal properties. He did not say whom, and I did not press. It occurred to me that the presence of someone curious in such a place adds an instrument to the air, a person who will look for a narrative thread. Dr. Finch and Claire had been in a brief discussion the day before about a study he had undertaken. He said carefully that Claire had asked him to suppress some notes. She wanted a quieter shore, he said, meaning something else entirely. How this quiet might be purchased was not spelled out. It was implicit in the way people tend to use language to soften demands. We compared notes about the torn envelope. Claire had been carrying several that were sealed. The fragment in her hand was addressed in her neat script, but the name was torn away. Marcus lifted the envelope and read aloud what was left of the line, a single surname, half of it missing. "It's not much," he said, "but it's something." He had a way of turning even small fragments into narrative. That is both the advantage and the weakness of the profession. We made a list of names that might match the fragment and then crossed them off one by one when they did not fit. The footprint outside the library door drew attention. Dr. Finch produced a small ruler and measured the tread. It suggested a smaller shoe and a light step. Maggie thought of Nora's paint-marked soles. Nora objected with the polite defensiveness of someone with no wish to be the only answer to a question. "I painted at the window," she said. "If some paint came in the hall, that's all." She did not claim to have been in the library at 2:40. She did not say she had been near Claire that night. The carefulness of her words struck me as genuine. People who have something to hide tend to give too much or too little at once. Nora gave just enough to be plausible. We discovered another small oddity, a tiny pebble, roughly the size of a coin, lodged in the folds of Claire's coat. It was a dull, dark stone like the ones Reverend Sam collected on his walks and kept in the lining of his pockets. He admitted then with a softness that he had given Claire a pebble the day before when she had seemed troubled. It was a small thing, he said. He was not a man given to drama. He said he had meant it as a gesture, nothing more. Conversations turned inward as people did what people do when confronted with a disruption. They assessed their own actions for possible culpability. Marcus asked if anyone had been in the library early in the morning and whether the kettle had been disturbed. Maggie said she had not been and that she had only discovered the room when she went in to fetch a book for herself. She had been meaning to check the log for the night and only then had found the chair where Claire sat. I noticed in the log a penciled entry marking a small payment and a note that read, simply, arranged with CB. There was nothing criminal in a ledger entry. It was merely a detail that suggested the house and Claire had done business of some sort. People do business in quiet houses. Secrets are sometimes kept as the cost of shelter. There were no accusations yet, only questions. People exchanged looks rather than opinions. Marcus wanted to know if anyone had seen an argument. Dr. Marcus. Finch repeated that he had only been outside and then returned, checking his hands for mud and traces. Reverend Sam suggested we wait for the authorities, but admitted the tide might prevent them from arriving promptly. I moved among them, asking questions that were simply invitations to describe and not demands for confessions. It is a modest method to ask and to let people find their words. I noticed the small discrepancies between recollections, a light in a window, a step in the hall, a scrap of paper seen and then not. Memory, I think, is generous in the moments that suit it, and miserly elsewhere. There is no shame in that. It is only human. And so the day proceeded with a measured curiosity. People returned to their rooms to pack or to check on their words, to look at their notebooks and see whether there was anything they had missed. The house settled into a patient watch. We kept the torn envelopes together under Maggie's supervision and left the library door closed, as if a door can hold the moment from slipping away. The tide pressed the shore outside, and the wind made small music with the eaves. I found myself taking notes with an unobtrusive precision and asking the kinds of questions that require patience more than force. It occurred to me that the truth, like the shoreline, reveals itself in small, patient measures. There is a peculiar clarity that comes from watching patterns settle after a disturbance. Once the immediate practicalities had been addressed, the room secured, the hosts contacted, we fell into a series of small routines that resembled our former habits, but with the added weight of careful observation. People move through the house with a caution I have found instructive. They keep their gestures small and try to make their footprints simple to read. I spent much of the next day watching for the kind of detail that is not dramatic, but is enduring. The kettle had a faint film on its rim where someone had stirred in something granular, and the teacup beside Claire's chair bore the faint crescent of lipstick that matched none of the guests' habits they admitted to. A smear of ochre on the arm of Claire's sweater seemed to match the tone of paint Nora mixed at the window. Nora's canvas, left in the studio, bore a small, freshly made stroke that looked as if it had been completed in the challenging light of a storm. I noticed how some things, once seen, insist on making themselves central. Maggie kept a close account of comings and goings. Her ledger showed that Claire had been up at 2:40, a fact that matched what Marcus had remarked upon. Marcus had been awake, he said, watching the sea and jotting notes. He had seen a dim light in the library and assumed someone was reading. What became important gradually was the way these small actions intersected. Nora had told me she often painted late into the night when storms came because the light then clarified what she wanted to put on canvas. She had said the habit without drama, merely as one states the time one prefers to work. That alone would not be remarkable. In a house at the edge of the world, many people keep late hours and private rituals. Yet when combined with other facts, the ochre on the coat, the footprint in the gravel that matched the smaller shoe, it began to sketch a line one could follow. Dr. Bill. Finch's instruments by the back door had recorded an odd spike in his measurements in the early hours. He told us, properly embarrassed, that he'd checked the gauge at 2:52 and had found it shifted. That is the sort of detail one files away. A watchman checking a dial at an inconvenient hour and noting something unexpected. It is not, in itself, a cause. It is a fact that must be framed. I began to map the timeline in the ledger of my own notes. Claire up at 2:40, perhaps handling her letters. Marcus, by his window, seeing a light in the library. Nora, painting and possibly walking past the room to fetch a new colour. Dr. Finch, outside and then returning. Reverend Sam, uncertain whether he left his room. None of the pieces fit snugly yet, but the map was taking shape. There was another discovery that made the map more precise. While looking through the studio, because I am the sort of person who makes himself useful by looking where others will not, I found a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath Nora's palette. It was a quick sketch, made with charcoal, a study of hands and a face in half light. The corner of the paper carried a notation in Nora's hand, 2:22, taken back. That small, precise time is the sort of thing an artist writes for no one but themselves. It was not a timestamp in the technological sense. It was a note to a moment she had seen and wanted to remoment she had seen and wanted to remoment. When I mentioned this in passing, Marcus's face changed. He had taken note of the light in the library at roughly that moment. There are curious ways that unconnected habits line up and suggest contact. The torn envelope, still lying on the tray under Maggie's watchful eye, bore, when examined closely, the remains of a list. A name, partially intact, was slashed by the tear in a manner that suggested the envelope had been opened in haste. It is a delicate matter to say another's business is of consequence, and I was careful with my words. But the fragment of writing was the sort of thing a person keeps when they have a business with someone else that they prefer to keep private. I noticed also how people adjusted their routines after the discovery. Marcus began to rise at an hour earlier than he had previously. He said he wanted to see where the tide left the rocks for footprints. Nora retreated to her canvas, but worked with more focus than before, as if to outrun thought with craft. Dr. Finch spent more time at his instruments, perhaps because measures are less ambiguous than talk. Reverend Sam kept turning his hand over a pebble as if to count edges where one might count sins. The house itself seemed to collect small, telling things, a faint contact of pigment on the library sill under the window, the way the stove's iron left a neat crescent of ash on the hearth, the way a chair was turned slightly away from the mantel. None of these facts is dramatic on its own, but a pattern of small facts is often a better map than any single telling detail. There were moments of gentle friction. Marcus questioned whether Maggie had truly noticed someone move through the hall that night. Maggie admitted that her mind had been on other things, and that she had only gone to the library when she found Claire. When confronted with timelines, people make small adjustments. They remember things that had seemed unimportant and forget other things that once felt central. It is normal. It is also the reason the slow work of collecting details matters. In the afternoon, I spent some time alone with the torn envelope. It occurred to me that if Claire had been carrying letters meant to coerce or to collect, someone might have come to retrieve one. The thought opened a fold of possibility, not a conclusion. I mentioned it to Reverend Sam in the kitchen while he washed a tray. He said, with a quiet kindness, that people often try to solve difficult things with quick remedies. The idea of someone retrieving an envelope in the night is plausible. The idea of someone doing more than retrieving is a different question. There is a particular value in noticing how people respond to being observed. Nora, under that modest pressure, finally admitted she had spoken sharply to Claire the afternoon before about a letter Claire had suggested belonged to her. She had said she would come at night to take it back if Claire would not stop. Her voice in telling this was not a confession, but a statement of a course she had considered. That admission, offered without prompt, is the sort of thing that can both implicate and exonerate. It leaves room for more questions. In the quiet that followed, I wrote down a list: times, movements, small objects. The sea outside kept its patient measure. I noticed that the truth, in this place, would not be revealed by one loud revelation, but by slow alignment, by watching where people's small habits intersected and where those intersections left marks. One might wonder, as I did, how many of us in the house had reasons to talk in whispers rather than make a sound. The question itself had a hush to it. Tension in a small house is like the weather in this part of the world. It gathers without warning and makes the ordinary seem precarious. That morning conversations sharpened. People who had been polite grew more careful in their speech. Others sought shelter in craft. Marcus in his notebooks, Nora in her studio, Dr. Finch in his instruments. Maggie moved among us with the steady competence of someone who has learned that maintaining the common room's order is a practical form of comfort. Marcus took to pacing the edge of the headland, returning with sea-soaked notebooks and a frown, as if trying to set a phrase correctly by force. He said that small fragments of the envelope matched a naming pattern he'd seen in other contexts. It suggested that Claire had been keeping track of debts in a neat ledger of her own, and that the letters might contain requests rather than mere notes. Marcus's phrasing was cautious. He did not want to speculate out loud, but his curiosity gave him a sharpness others found discomforting. Nora, when asked more directly about the ochre on Claire's sleeve, told us she had brushed the colour on a torn page of a test sketch and then carried the scrap in her pocket. The scrap, she said, had been given back to her to avoid an argument. That exchange, small and domestic, narrowed possibilities in some ways and widened them in others. It is surprising how easily a slight transfer of pigment can be turned in the mind into a line of account. Dr. 9. Finch continued to report his readings in the way of someone who treats the world as arrayed data. He became, for the moment, our most useful arbiter of time. His instruments offered us the best available approximation of when certain small movements had occurred near the shore. He told us he found a small depression in the grass by the old shed, a place no one had mentioned earlier, as if someone had set something down briefly and then left. The depression's shape matched the footprint found by the library door. It suggested a route that avoided the main path and hugged the lee side of the house. That discovery shifted suspicion in subtle ways. Patterns that had previously been merely possible now had a clear geography. If someone had moved from the shed to the library by the lee and not by the main approach, they might have thought themselves unseen. It is easy to be unseen by the house when the house has many angles, but it is harder to be unseen by the land. The land keeps a quiet record. Maggie suggested that we make a list of keys and who had access to particular rooms. There was nothing unusual in the pattern. The innkeeper held the master key. Guests had plain room keys. But someone, it appeared, had used a side door that night. The latch there showed fresh scratches. One of the more uncomfortable moments came when Reverend Sam, in his quiet and unassuming way, asked if anyone had ever felt extorted by Claire. The question landed like a pebble and made small waves in the group. Marcus, without meaning to dramatize, said he had known of people who were annoyed at Claire's methods of persuasion. He did not say he had evidence. Nora drew a breath and said simply that Claire had been persistent, that she had pressed artists for things and money in a way that left the recipient feeling drained. Claire's letters, Maggie said, contained requests and references that might be construed as coercive. We did not know the content of those letters. Maggie had, responsibly, promised to keep them intact until the authorities could decide what to do. Yet the knowledge that such communications existed was enough to give the question of motive weight. If Claire had been using correspondence to make demands, who was being asked to comply? If someone had tried to retrieve a letter at night, the retrieval might have been intended as a recovery rather than a confrontation. People began to place their memories like pebbles on the table. Marcus remembered a conversation Claire had had with Dr. Finch about a coastal plan. He thought he had overheard sharp words. Dr. Finch said he had been questioned earlier by Claire about releasing notes. Reverend Sam admitted he had gone into the library the day before to offer counsel about guilt. He had, he said, tried to help unharden a heart. She was not unkind, he said softly, but she was insistent. Words like insistent and persistent are small ways to describe pressure without naming a shape. I found myself watching how each person kept to their habitual places in the house. Nora painted by the window, but there was a new angle to her work. She had begun to incorporate fragments of words into the underpainting, as if the letters she feared had seeped into her medium. Marcus's notes grew brisker. He made a map and then erased paths that led nowhere. Dr. Humber. Finch's hands were steadier than his face. He kept checking the back door and comparing the tread marks to his own boots. At midday, while Maggie, changed the arrangement of the front hall to make space for the authorities when they should arrive, I asked to see Claire's notebook under her watchful eye. There were lists in a small, neat hand, appointments, names, addresses, and then a series of circled items that suggested transactions rather than friendships. I do not mean to make the ledger sound monstrous. It was simply a record of particular dealings, each circled item an insistence that something had been arranged. The pages had faint smudges where one might, in haste, have wiped a hand. We spoke in quieter, more deliberate tones as evening approached. People were tired. The house, too, seemed to be tiring of holding its own attention tight. The tide came in with a sound like a vast, slow turning. The light in the lamp upstairs made a small, circular argument with the dark. Outside, the weather bent toward more wind and a hard seam of rain. In the kitchen later, Reverend Sam put a hand on my shoulder as if to anchor both of us. "It is hard for a community to be formed by strangers in such circumstances," he said. "But perhaps not impossible." I did not answer him then. I had notes to make and a list of small things to check. As the day gave way to a wind-carved night, the house's shadows lengthened, and the small fragment of information we had pulled free of the first hours began to look more like a map than a scatter. A route emerged. Shed, lee side, library. Another route had been suggested by a note in Nora's sketchbook, a precise time she had recorded. The knowledge that someone had been keeping a time and that someone else had observed a light then is the delicate grammar by which events translate into action. We all sleep with that grammar now, and it will be what some of us awaken to explain. There comes, sometimes, a small moment in an inquiry when a piece that had been misplaced somewhere trivial slides out from the margin and the outline grows clearer. For us that day, the piece came in the form of a folded sketch found beneath a cushion in the back parlour, an odd place for an artist to hide work, until one remembers that people hide things in ordinary places to convince themselves those things are ordinary. I found it because I was looking in the house where the path of habit has been disturbed. Looking is both a kindness and a duty. The sketch was Nora's, charcoal, quick lines, a study of hands and a face in half light. Along one edge she had scribbled impatience, and in the corner she had written, with small careful strokes, 222, took it back. The handwriting was hers. She admitted it when I showed it to her. I didn't want to go to the library, she said, but she wouldn't stop. I thought taking the letter would make it stop. I told myself I could slip it back and no one would know. She looked at her hands, which were clean, in the way guilt sometimes persuades hands to be. That sketch was a hinge. It matched the ochre on Claire's sleeve and the footprint at the lee side of the house. It matched Dr. Finch's notation of an odd reading outside shortly after 2. It aligned, in a way that mere coincidence rarely does, with the small scrap of torn paper we had found clasped in Claire's hand. The scrap and the sketch, placed side by side, suggested a brief encounter that had ended without either party intending damage. What one must always do with such a moment is move carefully. People are fragile in the face of accusation. They are also fragile in the face of truth. I sat with Nora in the studio and asked her to tell me, very slowly, what had happened. She did not resist. She had been angry and afraid and had decided that retrieval was the right act. I thought, if I took the letter, it might make her stop asking me for money and paintings, she said. I went in. We argued. She laughed. She always laughed when she thought the matter small. I reached out. There was a sudden step, and she fell. I didn't mean for her to. I only wanted the letter back. It is a strange business to ask whether a fall is an accident and how one measures intention. Nora's description, offered simply, was consistent with the small things we had found. There was a smudge of ochre on the mantel, as if someone with paint on their hands had brushed past. The paperweight with the same pigment lay where a hand might have set it down. The footprint in the lee matched the smaller shoe. A pebble similar to one Reverend Sam kept was lodged in Claire's coat as if someone had been gesturing with it, or had been given it in a brief, odd exchange. The timing on the sketch matched the stopped watch in Claire's room within a few minutes. That alignment is not proof in itself, but it tightens the net. People often respond to such tightening in two ways, with flight or with hands that wish to explain. Marcus wanted an account written down as if the act of making the story coherent would anchor it to a truth. Dr. Marcus. Finch remained methodical. He retraced the small tackings of soil around the shed and confirmed the hollow where something had been placed briefly. Reverend Sam, in his quiet way, asked to speak alone with Nora, as if to offer solace rather than counsel. When the group assembled in the common room, there was an unspoken permission for Nora to speak openly in a safe space. She did. She told the small story again in front of us, with detail that made it no less awful. Her hands trembled as she described the argument, and the sudden tilt of Claire's body, as if gravity and a misstep had conspired in an instant. "I think she hit her head," Nora said, which is an awful thing to say and a precise one. She did not offer theatrical collapse. She offered a slow terminal description. Marcus read the notes he had taken with a voice that had the flatness of someone who had seen too many endings and did not want to be dramatic. "It is possible this was an accident," he said. "But there are particulars that require explanation. Why the torn envelope? Why the pebble?" The questions were not accusations. They were a way of asking for a chain. We then turned to the letters, because if Nora had taken one, there must be reason for it to have been worth taking. Maggie, with an admirable steadiness, produced the pile she had set aside the first day. The letters were, as Maggie had said, remarkably ordinary on their face. Requests, reminders, small accounts, but the tone of some was edged with persistence. Some asked for payment, some asked for promises. One was addressed to a name that matched the fragment found in Claire's hand. When we opened that particular envelope, we found a single page that suggested Claire had been pressing for something that could be described as leverage. It is easy to imagine blackmail of the melodramatic sort, threats and demands and dramatic ultimatums. In truth, the more ordinary versions are harder to see, persistent requests couched as favors, a demand dressed as counsel, the steady insistence that a person do something for the sake of convenience. Those versions are small and corrosive. Nora's explanation, which she gave with a battered honesty, was not of melodrama, but of slow pressure. Claire, she said, had been asking and asking until the request felt like force. When we had all heard this, the shape of what had likely happened that night grew in the shared silence. A person driven by fear or anger goes to retrieve a letter, words are exchanged, a scuffle or a misstep occurs, the other person collapses. There is an accidental cruelty at the heart of it. The law will have its questions about culpability and foreseeability, but the event itself is, in the human sense, one of those terrible collapses between intention and consequence. Even with that understanding, the last piece of certainty slipped just out of grasp. There remained the watch, stopped at an exact moment. The smear of paint, the pebble, the torn edge of the envelope. Each of these confirmed detail without proving motive beyond a reasonable doubt. I noticed too how each person in the room carried a small private weather of feeling, regret, suspicion, relief that there was an explanation that did not cast anyone as monstrous. We are, I think, prone to prefer explanations that preserve the possibility of goodness in people. I spent that night with the thought that sometimes truth is not a single bright thing, but a constellation of small, patient observations aligning until a figure appears. The constellation shakes itself out of the habits people keep and the slips they cannot hide. When these things fit, there is a quiet form of compassion in knowing the harm was not monstrous, but human. That compassion, however, does not remove the consequences. With the sketch and the timing in place, the house's answers began to converge toward a single account. It is important, in a matter such as this, to differentiate between what one believes and what one can show. The sketch made it plausible that Nora had been in the library at the time the watch stopped. The ochre and the footprint suggested she had been in contact with Claire. The torn envelope suggested a recovery had been attempted. Those facts, together, formed the lattice on which an explanation could be hung. We convened in the common room with a careful sense of purpose. Maggie sat with her hands folded. Reverend Sam held his pebble as a small comfort. Dr. Finch read aloud some of his notes about the night and the timings. Marcus offered his account of when he had seen the light in the library and when he had noted it gone. Nora came in with a shawl around her shoulders that had a faint, stubborn smudge of ochre on the hem. I asked her, simply and plainly, to tell us again what had happened. She spoke with a modest clarity that seemed to be earning her own forgiveness even as she gave it. "I went to get the letter back," she said. "I thought if I had it she would stop. We argued." She laughed. She said my work was cheap and that I should be grateful for any patronage. I reached to take it and she moved. I think she lost her balance and hit the edge of the hearth. There was blood, and then silence. I thought she would breathe. When she didn't, I panicked. I put the envelope back. I didn't mean for this to happen. I only wanted her to leave me be. She was not theatrical. She was simply a person telling a terrible truth in the smallest, most practical terms available. In such moments, the mind has a tendency to leap to hard pictures of malice, but human actions are often a tangle of small, misguided intentions. The fact that Nora's sketch matched the timing she described, and that the stopped watch, the pebble, and the footprint fit the account made her words believable in a way that felt dangerous to admit, believable in a charge, not in exoneration. Marcus, who had been waiting for a clear story to weave into a narrative, listened and then asked the question we all had in different forms: why put the letter back? Nora's answer was that she was frightened, that when she realized Claire was not moving, she panicked and thought herself guilty of a deed worse than retrieval, and that the instinct to hide complicity is older than the law. She had returned the envelope because she thought that if it lay as before, the event might be read as natural. That explanation is, I know, the sort of complacency that courts will weigh carefully. But it is also the thing that people do when they cannot imagine facing the consequences of an accident. Dr. Finch, who had examined the hearth and the furniture, confirmed that there was a small hard edge on the mantel that could cause a fatal blow if it made contact with the back of a head at an unfortunate angle. He did not, and rightly so, pronounce a medical opinion on cause of death in absolute terms, but he said enough to make the mechanics plausible. The combination of a fall and a hard surface is, in the quietness of the facts, a terrible and precise mechanism. Reverend Sam, who had counseled Nora privately before the group assembled, spoke with a small, even measure. "I do not pretend to know the law," he said, "but I do know a human heart when it confesses. Nora has told the truth as she knows it. There are degrees of harm and degrees of intention. We cannot let our need for an explanation make us cruel in our judgment. People have a way of making a private moral mathematics in moments like this." Each of us asked ourselves under our breath whether we would have done the same, and whether, in the instant of panic, we would have chosen to hide the evidence. It is not a comfortable measure. It is, however, a human one. There were, of course, other small questions that required attention. Who had sealed the letter in such a way that it felt recoverable? Why had Claire been keeping a ledger of names? Maggie explained that Claire had been engaged in several quiet dealings, some of them financial. Nothing in Maggie's knowledge suggested outright criminality. Some people keep accounts like prayers, Maggie said. They read them and keep them close. Marcus pressed gently on the issue of whether anyone else had a reason to wish Claire ill. He had, in the days prior, overheard a tense exchange between Claire and another party about an old property matter. He had not thought it material until we had to explain why someone might retrieve a letter after midnight. The more one pried, the more one found the ordinary ways people press on one another. Phone calls about payments, strings attached to favors, notes that steer conversation towards submission. These are the smallest of violences. In the end, the group found itself holding a particular explanation with a quality that was somber and soft rather than dramatic. Nora spoke to her action with the kind of contrition that is hard to look at. She had attempted a recovery, miscalculated, panicked, and then tried to hide the result. The fact that this was not a premeditated killing but an accident did not erase the moral and legal consequences, but it did shape our interpretation of the event as a human tragedy rather than an act of cold calculation. We agreed, with reluctance and with a tacit sense of duty, to tell the authorities what had happened. It was a small, formal thing in the face of an enormous private calamity. Nora asked if we would speak for her to explain what we knew. "Yes," said Maggie without hesitation. "We will tell the truth as we saw it." The decision felt, in that room of salted air and quiet light, like the most honest thing we could do. As evening closed, the house seemed to exhale. People moved through their tasks with a gentle, exhausted economy. Nora sat with Reverend Sam for a while and then retreated to her room. Marcus packed and repacked his notebooks with the nervous, neat movements of someone who expects to have to tell what he knows. Dr. Finch sat at his instruments and checked, once again, the measures of the sea. I made a list of what we would say, and a list of what we would keep silent about for now. There is a particular quiet that follows such convergence, not a neat resolution, only the containment of the main story. The sea outside kept its steady turning, and the house, which has a habit of collecting secrets when people bring them in from other places, kept its lamps lit for a little while longer. The authorities came when the tide allowed and the road cleared. Their arrival was necessarily ordinary: uniforms, a collection of polite questions, a procedural solemnity that makes even private grief seem like a part of the day's work. We told them what we knew. Nora, guided by Maggie and Reverend Sam, gave a fuller account than she had the first night. It mattered that she had not been hurried into a spectacle. Her words held their own shape, simple, regretful, and precise. There was a curious kindness in the way the small-town officers treated us. They were neither sentimental nor brusque. They accepted statements, made small notes, checked the logbook, and asked to see the letters. It is striking how administrative care can be a form of tenderness. When the letters were read, there was nothing cinematic in them, no explicit threats, only requests framed as urgencies. They were the kind of correspondence that wears insistence like a practical shoe. Nora's motives were, in their nakedness, comprehensible. Claire had been pressing for favors and money in a way that left Nora feeling cornered. The retrieval of a single page, in Nora's telling, was an attempt to reclaim dignity. That attempt had gone wrong. The officers listened closely. They asked about the scrap of charcoal and the small pebble and the time on the stocked watch. They noted all the connections that careful observers had already assembled. There are limits to what formal questions can reveal. Often the human particulars must be spoken by the human participants. After the official statements were given, there were private conversations. Reverend Sam sat with Nora in a quiet corner and spoke in a voice meant for consolation rather than admonition. "You told the truth," he said simply. "That matters." Nora's hands shook and she pressed them into her lap as if to hold herself together. There was an ache in that hush that the house kept away. A body keeps a memory, closely and with a kind of reverence. Marcus stayed to frame the account, not for accusation but for the necessity of having the facts aligned for those who would ask the difficult questions later. He was, in his pragmatic way, trying to make the story plain so that it could be carried without distortion. I found him near the window, watching as the police took the letters and the small items as evidence. "It feels like I am cataloguing someone else's life," he said, and I understood his meaning. The act of making detail into record is both a duty and an intrusion. Dr. Macking. Finch and Reverend Sam assisted where they could with the small formalities, and Maggie made tea and moved from small task to small task, like someone trying to keep a house from folding upon itself. She had the hospital, practical kindness of the person who keeps a place in running order so others can think. It is perhaps the truest kindness in such a place. There was, after the formalities and the statements, a moment when the group drew together and shared what the experience had taken from us. We were not a community in the way people in a village are. We were a sympathetic cluster of strangers. But for a short period we had been knitted by circumstance. Each of us had a part to play in what had happened, and each had to live with the choices we made thereafter. Nora asked if anyone would tell a particular truth on her behalf, a detail she feared might be misunderstood. She wanted it known that she had not gone to the library intending violence. Her intention was to recover a letter. This she asked softly, would we confirm? Reverend Sam did so without hesitation. Maggie, who had supervised the letters and seen how Claire tended them, confirmed that the correspondence had been of a coercive nature in several instances. Marcus corroborated the sketch timing with his notes. Small confirmations, together, gave weight to the narrative Nora had offered. Stillness returned in the manner of a place that recognizes its duties. The police arranged for transport for some of us and suggested that others might remain if they wished. Most of us chose to stay for reasons that felt private and practical. State and civic matters would be sorted in the days that followed. For the immediate hours, the house would tend to itself with the help of people who had come to the coast for solitude and found instead an imposition of human frailty. That night, I listened to the house breathe. I walked to the lantern and stood beneath the glass, watching the slow wheel of light turn. There is a particular honesty to such a light. It does not pretend to understand, only to mark. I found myself thinking quietly about accidents and intention. The world is a place of collision. People reach for things and sometimes strike more than they aim for. The moral calculus that follows such collisions is not simple. There are degrees of harm, and there is compassion as a part of justice. Nora came up to the lantern to look at the sea with me. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and watched the slow gold of the beam cut across the water. "I never meant it," she said, which was both true and inadequate. There are phrases that do not encompass consequences, no matter how honest they are. I said nothing for a while. Statements of remorse are private things. They ripple outward, but their center remains personal. We spoke, briefly, of the letters and of ways to make amends that were not merely financial. The officers would evaluate culpability. The community would take those measures it felt appropriate. What seemed clear to all of us was that Claire had exerted pressure in small, corrosive ways, and that Nora's response, while understandable, had led to an outcome none of us wanted. In the quiet that followed, I made my notes and then placed them aside. It is not my role to conclude. It is my duty to observe. The house held its own memories now, and each of its small objects, the pebble, the sketch, the stopwatch, had joined the quiet ledger. People who travel to the edges of things often find, unexpectedly, that the edge offers the best view of themselves. When they return, they carry what they have learned, like a weight or a gift. Nora, in particular, would carry that night for a very long time. So, I thought, would the rest of us. The day after the authorities took statements and evidence, the house resumed its ordinary, deliberate habits as if by mutual agreement. There are limits to what a few days and a thin circle of witnesses can hold. The law would take its place. People would be called and memories recorded. The small town would have its own prudent curiosity. For those of us who remained, the work was quieter, making tea, washing up, folding napkins as if ordinariness were a balm. Nora packed slowly in the morning, her movements precise but not hurried. She folded her canvases with great care, as if each sheet might be a small document of the night's arrangements. Reverend Sam walked her to the low path and gave her a small pebble in a brown paper, an old symbol of steadiness, if one can call it that. She did not speak much. Words seemed to be in short supply for her, which is natural after a night in which language has become so inadequate. Marcus decided to leave for the mainland that afternoon. He said he had to write a plain account of what had happened, and that he preferred to do it away from the house so as not to confuse the work with the watching. He thanked Maggie for the shelter and the tea, and he offered Reverend Sam a small apology for having asked too many searching questions. The Reverend smiled gently and said that questions are a form of care when handled well. Dr. Nisil. Finch stayed a little longer to check one last reading on his instruments, to be sure that the anomaly he had noticed the night before was not a sign of something larger. "It is comforting, in a way," he said, when I asked him what he meant, "to measure something physical when the rest is so full of feeling. Measuring is a method. Feeling is an account. Both are part of what we do to understand a world that refuses simplification." Maggie, always practical, made a list of things that needed to be done to keep the house in order. Call the suppliers, check the stove, see to the laundry. It is a strange and important detail that life in such a place goes on whether or not the weather feels merciful. She did not speak much of money or worry then. Her eyes, as she moved from task to task, had a steady competence that carried the place forward. When the tide permitted, a vehicle came to take Nora to the town. She stood on the small path with her coat drawn close, her face quiet. "I will go and say what I can," she said, as if the act of telling the whole story might make it lighter. "I will let them know everything. The weight of truth is sometimes reducible to the act of saying it aloud. It is a hard and honest thing to do." Before she left, she asked if she could show me one last sketch. It was small, a study of a face in half-light, the line work spare and exact. She had tucked the fragment of the torn envelope into a corner of the sketch, as if to reconcile it with the drawing. "I wanted to give it back," she said. "I wanted it to be not a shackle." The gesture was a quiet attempt at restitution, not an erasure of consequence. We stood for a while on the path that led to the main road and watched the last of the light gather over the sea. The lighthouse spun a slow, dependable circle. There is, in such light, an exactness that is comforting. It does not pretend to judge, only to mark where one stands. I thought about how people come to lighthouses seeking solitude, and how solitude sometimes is not a cure for the small insistencies of other people. In the days that followed, I wrote a careful account of what I had observed and offered it to those who asked. I did not offer a grand interpretation. I had in my notes the ledger of small things, the sketch, the stopwatch, the pebble, the smear of paint. I had also the human confession, which is a different sort of evidence, Nora's own words, offered without admiration and without attempt at theatrical meaning. She had not set out to cause harm, and harm had happened anyway. Sometimes that is all there is to hold. I did not stay for the formalities that followed in the weeks after. I left with a small suitcase and a cup of tea cooling on the sill. There is a particular softness to leaving a place that has required you to be present. You carry the hush with you. I prefer, as a habit, to take a seat by a window when I travel and to watch how the land recedes. That evening, the sea kept its steady beat, and the light of the lighthouse made a patient circle on the dark water. It occurred to me as the road took me back toward the mainland that the house would keep its own memories and that the guests, each in their way, would carry what had happened with the caution of those who have learned the fragile arithmetic of human consequence. The moral of such things is never singular. There are degrees here, in the pressure Claire exerted, in Nora's frightened attempt to retrieve what she thought unfairly taken, in the panic that made concealment seem, at the time, the only option. I am left with simple observations rather than neat judgments, the way a color leaves itself on a sleeve, the stopping of a watch, the habit of returning things to their place. Small details, in their accumulation, can show how an accident becomes a story. I do not tell this to make you pity Nora or to absolve her. I tell it because people who come to isolated places with private burdens sometimes find that those burdens meet other burdens and, by chance or force, change the lives around them. The lighthouse will keep turning. The house will take in other guests who come looking for quiet. The sea will continue its patient work. There is a particular quality to stillness after such a storm. It is not the absence of sound, but the rearrangement of it. I walked away from the headland with a small sack of notes and the clear image of the lantern wheel turning. There is a peace in the slow circular motion of such a light. It does not promise absolution. It promises only to keep, faithfully, the border between safe passage and peril. That, in the end, is our small consolation.